Hello, everyone. My name is Janko Wong, and today I would like to talk about some non-obvious risk areas with single sign-on systems. Just quick background on myself. I'm a threat researcher at Netscope. I've been researching several topics in the past year, including identity-based risk, mostly with cloud applications, which pretty much is everything these days. So what I'll do is jump into the presentation to make use of everyone's time. I did want to thank everyone for giving me an opportunity to come back and speak virtually at HackCon. I do wish I could participate in person, perhaps next year. So we might enjoy a beer or two. And this is live. I'm currently in the States, so it's a little bit early, and unfortunately, no beer for me. I'm just on caffeine. Um, Please do drop me a note if you ever visit the States. Maybe in 2026, you can come and bring your countrymen. We unfortunately missed Norway at this past World Cup. So why don't we jump into the topic at hand? Although, excuse me, I will be talking about single sign-on risk. There are several themes that I may come back to during the course of the presentation, and one of them are chains of trust, um, as well as attack chains and maybe API chains. Um, a second sort of concept is this idea of protocol risk, both from design and implementation, and protocols involved in single sign-on or identity systems. And hopefully we can be grounded throughout in concepts and principles so that we fundamentally understand maybe where the risk areas come from so that we can look forward and not always be reacting. So let's start just with a little bit of single sign-on. Um, it's funny in that I'm not sure about yourselves, but for me, single sign-on seems like an old topic. So really, my first question to myself, and I think is a fair one, is really what is new with single sign-on? If you think about it or are involved with it, it's been 10 or 15 years since the protocols underlying single sign-on have been around, including SAML. And if we look at that flow from a little bit of a user viewpoint and architecture viewpoint, we have this slide here. So I've simplified it greatly, but typically we have resources, applications that control various data that we want brought under one single sign-on umbrella. Um, there is often an identity provider flow, or single sign-on itself referred to as an IDP. User may start there. So most directory services offer some level of single sign-on, and there are companies like Okta. I'm sure you're aware of many that provide sort of pure single sign-on services. And the user may start there, log in, and be presented with a single sign-on dashboard of approved, let's say, enterprise applications, if this were an enterprise scenario. Um, they can, of course, select a particular application, Jira in this case, and immediately be brought into that application's website. They may, of course, select any application, and this is single sign-on, so no further authentication is required. In this case, this is more of a SAML-based single sign-on. So underneath, although we won't go into great detail, we're expecting the SAML protocol to be sort of in process here, and signed assertions and such being passed through the user agent of the user to the application and being validated and being accepted so that we get single sign-on functionality. So all of this makes sense, right? Nothing Nothing I would say that is a drastic surprise to any of us, since most of us at a minimum have been consumers or users in this process. And then probably many of us have in some way been involved with or exposed to some of the security issues. So that, uh, well, one thing I would like to point out is the flows can get a little bit more complicated. So single sign-on can also be initiated a little bit differently. Instead of at the identity provider side, it can start at the resource or application side. So again, we are probably familiar with this, and we might go directly to an application website. In this case, I'm using an example of Jira. Uh, and in some way, there's often an option to select single sign-on. Sometimes that is inferred from URLs, and the user may be redirected back to the identity provider. In this case, we're using Okta again as an example. And if the user's not authenticated, they will be prompted uh, and then be logged into the application. If they were already authenticated, that process would not involve a login or authentication with the identity provider. It would happen underneath transparently to the user. There would be redirects of some sort, and to the user, it would almost appear as if they were just seamlessly logged in. So I think it's fair to say that there is a lot of what I'll call conventional wisdom about single sign-on. And perhaps you would agree or at least hear of many of these things. Most of it is single sign-on is a good practice security-wise. Uh, First and foremost, it allows us to centrally manage authentication policies. By definition, there's a single area, a directory service of some kind, and that is generally a very good thing. We can, as security professionals, certainly reduce errors, ensure correctness, be consistent in our practices. We can actually put in place much easier password policies. That includes rotation of credentials, multi-factor authentication, password strength, pretty much everything. And from a threat or risk perspective, I also think it's fair to say that we are reducing the number of credentials or attack surface of the users involved. And I think without saying, but I will say it, the human layer 8 is often the weak link, right, in security. So all of this should be good. We have fewer copies of credentials, fewer credentials for users to track, and perhaps in theory, a more centralized area to do detection and other auditing. And I will say this is probably one of the few areas in my experience where it is more convenient for the end user. And in general, a lot of these are better security practices. So they align, which is a relief as opposed to be in conflict. So that's all great. And if that were it, I guess this talk would be very, very short. Forgive me, but I will pull a quote from this is an American CEO or head of Disney, and besides putting out good children's films like The Lion King or Snow White, there's a fairly general business quote that I thought did have some relevance to us in the security profession. And I think really the issue is if we approach any domain area and don't revisit it, just maintain the status quo, we are often exposed to risk because things do change. And we should, of course, probably know that because the security industry, the computer industry changes quite fast. So when I go back earlier to the opening of this talk and say, well, we have all probably been exposed to SSO. It's been around for 15 years plus more in terms of protocol development. we should at least pause to revisit the status quo to see if it's the same or if we've just made assumptions. So, really, what I want to spend most of the presentation uh, drilling into a bit is where do potential risks come from, and are they, as I suggest, maybe not so obvious or hidden? And so let's look at the tax side a bit and see if you agree with me that there's perhaps some new areas to revisit with SSO. So I am going to throughout operate partly between demonstration through flows and architecture diagrams. So if you allow me, I have a very simplified diagram where with SSO, there are really two entities that we often focus on. One will be the resource side, which is often the application, the website, the one that stores the data, and the other is the single sign-on system, which I will only point out certainly often is external to the resource domain in that it might be a different entity. We might be using an application that uses Azure Active Directory, completely different entity, different vendor, and there's communication between the two. But large website or application ecosystems, if you will, certainly have their own built-in directories that provide single sign-on. So you might think of Microsoft or Google as one of those vendors that has such a large app ecosystem that they also have a directory service that would be built in. That's why I have a SSO small circle or bubble there. That aside, let's continue on. I want to talk about maybe some assumptions that some of us have made or might fall into the trap of when thinking about SSO, right? And one of those is going back to one of my earlier points. Well, we have centrally managed credentials with SSO. Therefore, we're more secure, almost by definition, some of the common wisdom points that I mentioned. But I want to challenge that a little bit. I think there's some risk area because our assumptions may not be completely accurate, or they may be missing perhaps some of the change and evolution that has happened over the years. So, not to be too um, glib about this, but if you have centrally managed anything, it does become more of a central point of failure or point of compromise. But specifically, what I mean by that is if credentials are compromised, I'll call it a large blast radius can exist. Makes sense. That's nothing new or novel. But once access is gained, then every application that falls under that SSO umbrella is now exposed or at risk. I think most of us might say, well, of course, that's again nothing new, but I don't know that we um, fully think about what that really means in practice and take measures to reduce risk. And I will get to a more specific example shortly. But the other thing I want to point out is that centralization of credentials in SSO systems is actually contrary, in my mind, to a different security principle that conventionally we also, most of us seem to adopt, which is isolation and compartmentalization and segregation. So, what do I mean by that? I think the ideal in terms of credential management would be that for every resource we access, let's take websites, we would use a unique password, ideally a unique username if we could, so that the compromise of any one credential would not immediately expose another resource, another application, another website to the attacker, right? And so we use password managers, right? Those are, of course, harder to do across the general public or population. But that's a very different principle, different goal than centralization. And I also think the large majority of enterprises would agree, because rarely are production environments under the same SSO umbrella as non-production environments. They in fact split them in two, even if they are under the same uh, directory or identity system. So if we are a Google customer, our production environment has its own Google uh, workspace directory that is completely separate from non-production systems. That I think would be very common. Same with Microsoft Azure AD. Same even if you're running your own directory services. That is what I would propose is much more common. So in practice, already this idea of centralization is already modified because I would say people understand that there's a risk of putting all of our credentials in one basket, if I may. And with that, there are opportunities for abuse. So specifically here, centralization, I think, leads to a form of supply chain attacks. Now, that is a bit of a marketing term. In this case, upstream attacks against the SSO system can certainly expose risk to perhaps the applications and data that you may control. And so, very briefly, one of the more famous identity, I would say, supply chain attacks is Golden SAML. And I just want to revisit that briefly. So this is a flow of a SAML flow, which sort of underlines, we don't need to go into great detail here, it underlines a little bit of the screenshot graphic flow that I showed very early on in the presentation. With Golden SAML, part of the key concept is that the signing keys have been compromised for the AD federated services. Once that happens, and this is referencing Cyberark's original blog post about this, which, to put in perspective, is over 5 years old, the Golden SAML attack being described. Once you have the signing keys, you can effectively do man-in-the-middle attacks on SAML assertion requests. And you can generate and sign any SAML response and send those to the application or websites. This is using AWS as the application area. And this is very dangerous because the protocol itself, the key point I want to make is it's stateless, because if you remember or think back to it, the user can start with identity provider side and have a request be sent to the application side, and the application will have no state. And that's the way SAML was designed, to be simple and easier in that sense. So in this case, the man-in-the-middle attack, the attacker can be signing requests and send them off, and they will be accepted. And suddenly a authenticated session will be in place. There's no prior exchange required, right? The attacker can initiate this. Now, there's still a high bar to clear. Obtaining encryption signing keys, I should say, requires some compromise of the SSO side. So it's a high bar, much like compromising client endpoints are, but probably a higher bar because those would be protected more. Having said that, we do have recent evidence where it's been in the wild, right? Part of the SolarWinds attack, which was, I think, primarily a different supply chain attack, more about software updates, distributing Trojans and backdoors. But it also involved a Golden SAML attack, which in many ways, I think, is perhaps the more dangerous part, because it may be harder to detect that signing keys have been compromised. So I want to point out that although this is 5.5 years ago, it in fact has been in the wild very recently, in probably one of the more largest public kind of supply chain attacks that we've experienced with just a vendor's software. So let's go back to maybe a different assumption, but that first one that I pointed out was this idea that centrally managed, I think, it is not to say there aren't advantages. There are. There are also risks, and we should, at a minimum, be aware of the dependencies we have. So let's talk about a second assumption that might bring risk. And this one is, well, we understand SSO because it has been around for so long. So we know the risks and we can manage those and still obtain the benefits. And of course, that is true. But I think what is perhaps missed is SSO is actually more complicated than we may realize. The more you dig into its implementation, I think the more surprise you may find. So SAML, we've been talking about, and many enterprise, um, security professionals will understand that because that's the most popular sort of implementation protocol-wise. But OAuth also appears in SSO. So OIDC um, was to extend OAuth to fulfill SSO. But we also see custom OAuth or custom uses of OAuth for SSO purposes, and I will talk a little bit about that. So I would say just superficially, at a very quick glance, SSO is not as straightforward because there are different protocols underneath, and that leads to risk. It makes the attacks more complex because they are protocol specific. We have seen that because of the very protocols. OAuth is more focused on REST APIs than SAML, and that opens up additional risk in terms of chaining of attacks. And the way we see abuse, well, I want to go through some examples of that. So let's talk about a phishing attack that we may see just with a SAML implementation of SSO. So I want to show a victim view, and I want to acknowledge work done several years ago by a researcher, Jordan Potty. The reference there is on this slide. And then this was a way to phish using SSO systems in place. This is an Okta example, but we can find this in other SSO providers as well. So this is the user view or victim view. What you would receive in this attack, and we will then go into how it's carried out shortly, is you will receive an email, and it will come from okta.com. In this case, there is no forged or spoofing of email. This is actually a valid email that will be sent from Okta. Okay, so that's not the trick or key to this attack. It will contain a link. Okay, this is all about something with your MFA system. So ideally, this is targeted at victims who use Okta. And in that link, it will lead to okta.com. No tricks there. So if the user is tricked into clicking that, and you can read this text, it looks fairly reasonable as something you might receive if you're using MFA. What happens is you're in fact following a link to okta.com. Now, if you look closely, the researcher, it is a subdomain of okta.com, and the researcher put their own name in there. Okay, but I want to point out that the top level domain, the primary domain, is okta.com. That will actually redirect to a URL specified by the attacker. So in this case, that is the evil domain controlled by the attacker. And this Okta login is a fake one, created and presented by the attacker. So the main sort of new area to understand is, why is there a URL redirect from a potentially valid domain, okta.com, even if it's a subdomain, before we get to the attacker domain? And I raise that because most of our anti-phishing, as well as anti-malware and such, is heavily focused on domain filtering. And here, although we do end up in a attacker-controlled domain, and that possibly could be discovered and blocked, we started out with a redirect, which would be much harder to detect because we would need a policy if we were truly a customer that was using Okta to allow straightforward okta.com domains, but not allow subdomains of Okta. So that was a lot in a short period. Let me show a diagram of what potentially is happening in that attack. We saw the user viewpoint, and from the flow, the attacker actually has an ability to control step one and send a legitimate email that originates from okta.com. The victim sees this, clicks on that URL, which that initial URL I want to reiterate is an okta.com. It is a subdomain, but the subdomain is chosen by the attacker. So there's a chance to make that much more realistic. Instead of the researcher's name, it could certainly be the company's name or something of the victim or something close. That does do an immediate redirect. So given that this step 3 involves the user's browser, yes, there's a chance to catch in step 3 that this is an attack. And you could imagine we use the same techniques or similar techniques that we do to detect phishing sites. So I'm not here to say that this is a completely new attack that is undetectable. No, we have a good chance to use current techniques in step 3. I am saying that step 1 and 2 makes the problem harder and should cause us pause to think about whether our current controls in place would detect this phishing attack that sends a valid email from okta.com containing an okta.com URL where okta.com itself is doing the redirect. You may ask at this point, very interesting, at least I did when I first discovered that, what capability exists that sort of allows this to happen? Well, this flow is back to SAML, and I don't really want to go through all the details here, but if we are thinking from the attack side and a phishing attack, generally we would look at spoofing or impersonating the service provider or the identity provider in order to fool the user. What has happened over the years, at least 3 or 4 years ago, was probably for business reasons or user requests, the identity providers, say Okta, allowed a custom identity provider to be installed. That is, you can configure Okta to redirect to a custom identity provider that you control. Effectively, they will handle the front end for the user. And the way that is carried out is through what we just demonstrated or showed. You can register. I will now, sorry, let me move forward. Let me talk about what the attacker can do through normal Okta functionality. They can, in fact, create custom email templates within Okta. You can specify a subdomain-based URL of your choosing that will call out to your own code that does the actual credential check. This is what the redirect points to. Evilsite.com was really whatever you wish. It is your domain. You can set up contacts. You can do an activation and actually send out emails with your custom email. Now, this is sensible if you think about administering SSO, and perhaps some of you have. But the irony, I think, is that this is very much what you do in a phishing campaign anyway. And there's almost a phishing as a service feature here. So what I found interesting about all of this is that unless you realize this functionality exists, you may not be sensitive to the whole risk area of perhaps an easier phishing attack against users that utilizes the trust of the identity provider itself, because now it's involved with emailing and messaging. It's involved with a URL redirect before the attacker gains control with their website. So in this case, the abuse is more at the protocol level. That's why I have sort of a foundation in the parenthetical. That SAML phishing is a way to be more specific to the protocol and introduce risk there. And if we don't understand the protocol, it can be Very, very challenging to even know that this risk is out there in the first place. So let me go through a second example that is more of a protocol abuse. Different vendor. That was the SAML fish. I want to talk about SSO. This is Amazon AWS's version of SSO. So in this view of the world, imagine you are a customer, an AWS customer wanting to offer up SSO to your employees to gain access to not just your AWS cloud environment, but other applications like Salesforce, Atlassian, whatever, right? And in this case, the SSO directory provider, you could choose to use AWS's built-in directory services and their portal. They call it Identity Center. And if you do use that, this is the user viewpoint. You log in. This is set up with a user with a very obvious name. Logging into this using AWS's version is not that different. MFA could be certainly enabled. And when you log in as a user, you're brought to a dashboard. This is perhaps a little bit less sexy than Okta's dashboard. It's not really AWS's business, but it's the same idea of a dashboard of approved applications that are all under SSO. Salesforce is one example. And so you could click after you authenticate and be brought directly into Salesforce. You could, of course, click on Atlassian and be brought right into Jira or one of the Atlassian applications. Nothing new there. Functions very much like you would expect. And underneath, although we're not showing it, we could validate that what's happening underneath is very much a SAML flow in this case, because when you set this up, you are doing all of this SAML configuration. So far, everything is as we expect, nothing new here. So why do we care about this? Well, let's talk about the third area, which is one of the other apps that we haven't quite explored is the AWS cloud environment. And it makes sense that, well, it's a website that could certainly be treated as an app. When you click on it, I don't get launched immediately in there. What starts to become interesting or different is I have two further links. One's Management Console, one's Command Line. Management Console actually does what we would expect. With 2 clicks, I can be brought into an AWS cloud environment under single sign-on. Okay, that makes sense to me as a user. What is this command line or programmatic access? Now, if you have not ever gone through this flow with AWS, I would say this is a very confusing idea of what this actually does, because if we were to guess what it does, I think we would get 100 different answers if we polled the audience. Why? Because what does it really mean for command line or programmatic access to be brought under an SSO umbrella with browsers accessing web apps or websites? As an example, if I click on that, do I get an in-browser command line session, almost like a shell, without having to log in? Is that the SSO? Or is it something else? But if you actually are experienced with AWS, that actually makes no sense at all. It could be technically done, but AWS command lines are not, they're not interactive sessions. They are sort of a batch tool. You run a command, it exits. You don't, it's not a Python interpreter where you run it and can actually interact with it and have it keep running. So there are these funny things, and I only say that because later we will see that it leads to problems. The yellow flag that should cause us pause is one of the reasons that is documented by AWS of having this SSO is to extend it to command line or programs that are created by users. I would say that is probably the first yellow flag because it's very hard to think about what that experience means. How do you bring CLIs and browsers and other client applications that are very different under SSO? What does that really mean? I log in via the browser, I go to a CLI and it magically knows that I'm logged in. and I don't have to authenticate. Technically, you can do things like that, but it's very hard to think of how that would actually work. When you do click on that, the answer is nothing happens. You're giving credential information. So if you're not familiar with Amazon Web Services, almost the predominant model are hard-coded IDs and API keys. These are the credentials for executing API calls. You are given that information, presumably, so you can use that within your programs. Again, this has nothing, in my mind, related to an SSO experience. Worse, this is doing something that is very dangerous in my mind. What is that? We're not even talking about SSO, we're talking about security practices. If you are an AWS customer, but this applies to many applications, there's a compartmentalization and isolation of credentials. That is, because what I mean by that, if you gain access to my endpoint, to take a different example, you do not get my clear text passwords. You might get hashes in my password file, certainly. No, almost no application environment, including AWS, normally gives you full decrypted credentials. In fact, if I'm normally logged into the AWS Management Console as a user, and I go to the API key section, I cannot get the information that is shown here. This is obfuscated, but these are the full secret access keys. So what I'm pointing out here is that this SSO environment was implemented differently and goes against probably a common security practice that AWS practices 99% of the time, which is compartmentalizing API credentials and not just exposing them, even if you have access to the user account that owns those keys. However, on the SSO side, it is exposed. That's a second warning flag. And we'll see how some of this now introduces risk. And of course, this is extremely dependent on implementation, right? This is AWS's. And these are the things that, even if we understand SSO and everything that I've said today, you may not understand AWS SSO. Let's go through. I'm going to, in the interest of time, click through this video that just shows some risk areas here. This is just showing an Amazon S3 bucket that I created somewhat humorously. Imagine that there is a secrets document, and this is the missing, let's say, cryptocurrency from the FTX debacle. And I'm just going to log out, and I want to go through a flow to make this a little bit more real. So here, let me back up. When you log in, I have already shown screenshots here. Let me get to an attack, which is also how you might vet. This is the real way that CLIs in from AWS's viewpoint would be utilizing SSO. That was the question that I posed, was very confusing. It's not through the browser where you have that funny CLI link that just shows credentials, API credentials. What is documented is if you want a CLI that makes use of your AWS SSO user credentials that were pre-set up, this is what you do. This just shows in great detail individual steps and curl commands so that we know at a low level what is actually happening. And I did have a reference early on, and sorry, I did not call out to the researcher who showed this. There were a couple good references on an earlier slide available for you to look at later. But let me go through what has been documented by AWS and shown by researchers of what happens. The first step you do is what is called, you obtain an OAuth client application ID and secret. One, you may ask, OAuth, why is that in the picture? Well, that is AWS's implementation. This is where SSO can suddenly bring in a different protocol. What is this idea of obtaining a client ID? That is part of the OAuth protocol. If you're not familiar, you usually have a third-party application. In this case, it's in theory your CLI or your tool or program. You need an ID and secret to do anything OAuth. So unauthenticated, you can make this curl call, and what you receive back is a client ID and secret shown in the green here. Okay. Now you can start to speak OAuth with AWS. So you make a second call and you start to do a particular flow or part of the protocol with OAuth that is called device code in auth. Now, if you know or are familiar with OAuth, it is much more complicated, number one, than I would say than even SAML, which can be complicated. Two, it is made for authorization, not authentication. So although OIDC extended OAuth to do SSO, I think that is another flag because you're using something designed for authorization for authentication. It can be done. I am not saying it's bad or impossible. I think it is a risk area to use something designed for one purpose for another purpose. Anyway, as part of that, a device code flow was actually designed for smart TVs that had difficult input mechanisms, not full keyboards. That's another yellow flag. We are using a part of an authorization protocol designed for dumb devices for my single sign-on. Again, could be done, but what you may or may not know is device code flow poses additional risk. It's easier to phish customers, and we will show an example there. Let's continue on. What you do with device code flow is the attacker or the valid application, the CLI that you developed that you want to be under SSO, can generate device code and user codes, which will then be used with the user. And in fact, at the bottom, you can see that there is this URL that the user should now follow and authenticate with. It is an AWS, a valid AWS one. But because it involves a short user code, it is more susceptible to phishing because there are many stories that we can create to fool users into codes, using codes or thinking codes are normal, whether it's MFA codes or reset codes or promotional discount codes for shopping. I will also point out that the user code is set as a parameter. And so this is a simple get call. So imagine we deliver this through email to the user and we trick them into clicking it. Or if this were a valid application, a real CLI program, we would tell the user that this is how they authenticate. Now, you may be confused because this is very complicated and you have every right to be. The one thing I will also point out is I'm not sure this is a SSO experience of any kind. If you are running a CLI program and you tell a user that they have to follow this link and then authenticate in a browser every single time they use the CLI. Let's continue on. And what I did is launch that URL. You can see that same URL. So imagine the user now. Although I showed in great detail on the left what was going on with the CLI or perhaps an attack, what that CLI might do is tell the user to go follow this URL or might launch a browser locally. And this is the first thing the user would see. Oh, I'm trying to use a CLI. I want to do SSO. I'm brought to this page. Look how insane this implementation is. This is very typical OAuth device code flow. It's insane, if I could use that, because the URL, of course, shows the user code. This web page, this implementation pre-populates that code. That field happens to be that obscure password type of an input field. That's nonsense. What is that code? It's right there, exposed in the URL. It's exposed in the the HTTP traffic. Nonsensical implementation of security, right? Anyway, let's continue on. That is not the main piece. Part of what would happen right after that, I think I jumped ahead because I'm clicking through this, is the user would go through full authentication here, including MFA. Okay. Oops, I'm sorry. Let me get back to where I was. Okay, right here, they would go through full authentication. And the next thing the user sees in this flow, is this dialog, authorize request. The text is very generic. This is all part of OAuth. This is very typical for device code flow. and it's completely confusing because it's so generic. Something authorized and request, you want to set, allow, or cancel. The dangerous part is OAuth typically provides more detail about permissions, but device code flow is known to be implemented with nothing. Why? Because it was designed for you and I as consumers sitting in front of our smart TV, giving our smart TV access to our Netflix video subscription. And of course, a consumer would be confused by anything more than allow or cancel. So we've taken a consumer usability case for authorization, but we're applying it to SSO. So please bear with me. The more your head hurts, like mine does, the more risk there is that this can be abused. So once the user hits allow, they get another generic, it's approved. Now, if this were a normal valid case, no malicious intent, this would be a CLI causing me to authenticate in a browser. I, as a user, may not be suspicious. I might potentially just say, okay. Meanwhile, what that CLI does now is it's able to retrieve an OAuth token. It does a few things in between, okay? That is part of the suggested implementation by AWS. And ultimately, it does a little bit of discovery with all the information it received. And where I wanted to end up is it actually can get an AWS API key, the exact same API key shown in the browser when I clicked on the CLI. And it can now use that AWS API key to make an AWS API call and get that bucket secrets that I had shown, the FTX Bitcoin bucket and the secrets.doc. Confusing, isn't it? Not only because OAuth is confusing and you may not be familiar with it, there were 8 or 9 steps of what the valid program should do. However, we also switched context, and that is really, I want to step back from this. Sorry, I'm going the wrong direction here. We switched context. What do I mean by that? If I were using AWS SSO solely from the browser, I would be talking SAML in the browser. It would be very standard in what most of us are used to. No surprise there. Once, however, I tried to bring CLI under the umbrella with Amazon's implementation, I'm switching from a browser to a CLI and trying to bring it into the same umbrella, even though, as I said before, it makes no sense to me what that user experience means. Maybe you have a better explanation, but I don't understand how a single sign-on experience can cover a browser and a CLI. We also switched from SAML to OAuth. And what I showed in the details is this flow. Okay, the screenshots. I ultimately want to get an OAuth token, which I can. And then I want to get AWS API keys. So I'm switching domains, credential models. I'm moving from SAML, I'm moving from browser to CLI, I'm moving from SAML to OAuth tokens. I'm moving from OAuth tokens to AWS keys. Each of these transitions is a glue, probably by Amazon, to make their SSO work, because they really speak AWS API keys for all their APIs. However, once they entered SSO, they start with SAML. Then they wanted to bring CLI in. The danger here is each of these points become points of attack. There are OAuth specific attacks, there are CLI attacks because they cache tokens, cache credentials. Of course, there are browser and SAML attacks. Plus, it's very confusing. And why do we have to translate credentials from one model to another? All to get access to AWS from a CLI. And you can imagine that an attacker could run through that script. So that may be very confusing. And my point there is really, there are so many protocol-specific abuse areas that are at risk. And I know I'm running slightly long, so I apologize. I may actually speed up, which may not help you. But here is sort of a third kind of attack or abuse that is now focused really at the protocol level. So let's talk about a different assumption we also might make. Okay, forget that this is also complicated. Yeah, we get centrally managed may bring risk. We know that the protocols underneath SSO may have risk, but can't we just break it down into small pieces, secure the pieces, which is a security kind of strategy, and be done? And I will say that you cannot do that because the sum of your security with the pieces is less than perhaps the whole system. Um, and I think part of that reason is we get very obscure attacks because all of this is on top of HTTP, but the protocols have evolved. OAuth is a good example to be very REST API focused. So suddenly the chaining of web attacks with perhaps SSO systems becomes more complicated. And it leads to these very obfuscated, almost magical attacks. And to give you an example there, I apologize again, this may make your head hurt. It certainly makes my head hurt. I want to talk about a Facebook takeover account attack. And I will acknowledge Yosef Samuda, who just a year ago, but he's done dozens of these, documented one takeover, Facebook takeover, account takeover attack, where when Facebook was configured to use Google as its SSO system. And this shows something that's very complicated, and I would suggest is very hard to foresee. It started with seemingly benign or innocent kinds of functionality or design. One was there's SSO that Facebook supports with Google Identity. It happens to use OAuth, OIDC specifically. There's nothing wrong with that. That can work. The second piece was there's a sandbox, a different domain for Facebook in the top right, FBSBX. Sandbox, why would they have that? It's maybe so if you have a Facebook group, maybe you create a custom page. Salesforce has a sandbox. It's not uncommon, nothing crazy about that. But of course, we know with sandboxes, part of that is the users in control of the content and they can upload custom HTML, CSS. We can foresee that this, of course, would lead to web attacks, cross-site scripting, etc. But it's a different domain. So normally that can be managed, nothing crazy. The third piece on the right, though, is a trust relationship. This is probably the big mistake. There is a trust relationship put in place between the Facebook domain and the sandbox domain by Facebook developers. Specifically, when you reset a Facebook password, you would enter a state where you have to enter a CAPTCHA. That CAPTCHA was actually hosted on the sandbox domain. So to actually show that, there's an iframe on the main Facebook domain that refers to the sandbox domain, but it's really subtle where the vulnerability or exposure comes in. Exposure comes in with those three pieces. The sandbox, of course, allows cross-site scripting and CSRF and other attacks. The SSO allows OAuth tokens to be resent and reset. And that's not a surprise. When you reset a password and your SSO system is external, well, credentials ultimately get passed around. The trust relationship on the right is the big one. There was data leakage. If you are in a password reset state and you try to access a Facebook URL, it redirects you through this iframe to the sandbox, but it passes along in a parameter the refer, the actual URL that you're trying to access in the Facebook main domain, along with its parameters. Suddenly you might intuit that now there's exposure because maybe some of the credentials from the OAuth token side could be passed to the sandbox side if I do things properly. And of course, the attacker has a chance to control the sandbox or direct a user. So without fully understanding this, you may go through the references that I cited. The flow goes like this. The attacker can upload custom code to the sandbox. They can trick a user to visiting their code. That code will put the user into a certain state, a password reset state that the attacker controls. Part of that is going through this password reset phase and getting OAuth codes passed that can be used to obtain tokens. And because there's a trust relationship, once you're in a password reset state, some of that is forwarded onto the sandbox, back to the code that the attacker has put in place. And you can see how this chains together to ultimately allow credentials back to the attacker. And then they can recover passwords and take over the account. 9 steps, very non-intuitive, interaction of sort of 3 areas: a trust relationship, a credential system that rides on top of HTTP, and of course, some custom code. But bridging 2 domains, very hard to foresee, right? I don't, although I said there was a mistake on Facebook's part, I don't necessarily say that this was an obvious, that could have been caught in a design review. This was a difficult one. So,
sorry to interrupt, Jenko, but you have to share your slides again.
I apologize. That dropped.
They just dropped, so it's no problem.
Yep. Apologize for that. Let me see if I can get that. Is that sharing? Not that one. Oops. So let me show. How about that? Nope. I apologize. I know I'm running late, so I'm going to apologize for keeping you through your lunch hour. I will finish. Okay. Everyone can see that? Thank you. So I ended up here and was just pointing out that this is a very complicated chained attack, non-obvious, combining web attacks with new REST-enabled OAuth calls. And yes, probably a mistake in design where Facebook put in a trust relationship and a passing of data between their production domain and a sandbox, which was exposed to custom code by users. But this is a very difficult area to foresee. The last area, and I'm going to accelerate this again, I apologize for running over. Again, we could ignore this complexity. We might just say, look, we're talking about SSO and authentication. Let's just use the common things like MFA and we'll be okay, right? We're overstating the risk area. To some extent, MFA, of course, will help. There are 2 problems with that. One, if we compromise, a lot of the identity systems, OAuth specifically, use tokens. So once you obtain and compromise the token, you won't face a MFA challenge. That's problem number 1. So MFA does not solve everything, and it's also hard to implement. But what's hidden here is once you get access to resources, then it's not an authentication problem. It's an impact problem. You gain access to maybe more apps and data because this is SSO. One compromised app may give access to many more apps and data. So the Microsoft device code fish, Dr. Azure AD, Dr. Cinema did great work there. The Secure Works team also did work. What device code appears in Microsoft? It's common enough, not a great reason. I am going to point out very quickly how a phishing attack can be done. And this will hopefully be less confusing than the AWS version, but show a much greater impact in a different way. So I'm just logging into email with MFA as a regular user on the left, showing Outlook. Nothing there. But on the right, I'm showing an attacker, well, how an attacker can phish this user because of Microsoft's implementation of SSO. Okay, and that'll become apparent. The user The attacker can do device code, generate a user code and device code from anywhere running a script. They don't have to create any application, no fake websites. They can send to this user on the left an actual URL, okay, with a code. And when that, here's the actual email. I took pains to make this a while ago. You can see a user code. This is a real Microsoft login. There's nothing fishy here. Okay, this is not part of the attack. This is a normal OAuth login with device code in Microsoft. This is just creating a story, though, to trick the user to logging in with Microsoft with this code. So if they go ahead and do that, here, unlike AWS, you have to actually copy and paste the code. It doesn't pre-populate it. They put in the code. They authenticate, possibly with MFA. And once they do authenticate, you get simple dialogues that don't really tell the user anything. Are you trying to sign in? Yes, you're approved. That's it. That's all the attacker needs. Now they obtain OAuth tokens directly. There's no translation to API keys because this is Microsoft and they are more purely OAuth, okay? And with that token, they can access AD users, okay, and emails, okay, what the user can access. None of that's a surprise. What is a surprise is that they can pivot. They can trade that token in and refresh and get a whole new token with access to Azure Cloud. This was a phish pretending to be Outlook, gaining access rights to Outlook or the Graph API. But what Microsoft allows is the token to be effectively traded for another application or API domain, Azure Cloud. And that is a hidden risk if you don't know about it. Why would they do that? That's really not the OAuth model. They did it because they implemented SSO for their own applications. And you can understand that from the browser, you could quick switch among applications, right, on the far left. And what they're doing underneath is some OAuth, I would say custom OAuth, where they're trading tokens that have access to Word and OneDrive or something else that might be Azure. So because Microsoft wanted to implement SSO this way, it opened up a phishing attack that was easier because of device code, choice of device code. And because of SSO, could pivot and have a lot of downstream large effects where I'm enumerating on the right all of the Azure resources, which when I jump to the Azure portal as that user, they are global admin, and all of these resources are now at risk. So a phishing attack to a user under the guise of Outlook becomes access to over 30 applications of Microsoft that fall under an SSO umbrella because OAuth was chosen to be used as SSO, and it was a custom OAuth implementation. So there is big implications with that. And architecturally, this is an OAuth flow, still simplified, of what happens under that attack. The authorization step is too simple, but the real danger is here. After the OAuth access token is obtained, there's this lateral movement because it's an SSO implementation where I can fool the user into gaining access to what Office 365 can access. And then I can also access any of 30 plus applications, including, let's say, all of Azure Cloud. So huge downstream attack. There's been some great work at DEF CON. Melvin Langvik had a good presentation and an open source tool. The links are here of just brute force attacking credentials straight up with passwords, but then data exfiltrating across all of these SSO apps. So imagine you don't even have to phish users. You can just brute force and guess common credentials, and then with one tool, grab all the data that exists across OneDrive and across all apps. And that's my point, is the hidden risk here that may not be so obvious is it's not just an authentication problem. It is once post-compromise, there may be an immense or much larger impact in terms of blast radius, as demonstrated by the device code attack. And so to wrap up, again, I will apologize once more for running so long. Let's step back from this. Why are we even in this state? And it's because in large part, there's protocol complexity. There's SAML, there's OAuth, and the implementation of those two differ among vendors. Here's the SAML flow once again. We don't have to cover it, but it's complicated enough. Here's one OAuth flow. This is the common one we might see on the internet when we shop, where the payments vendor is involved with your shopping website. You have four parties involved: the user, the application, the identity system, and the app being accessed. Here's device code flow, part of OAuth. Very complicated, and they're also REST API enabled, right? It makes it easier for attackers to exploit remotely. There's no advanced attack against endpoints required. This is meant to be remotely accessed. All of this leads to obfuscation, web attacks being combined with protocol-specific attacks. And all the controls by all the vendors involved are behind for preventing, detecting, and remediating. All of this confusion has led to, I think, some suspect design decisions. Authorization used for authentication. Again, I'm not saying that's impossible. It's just suspicious when something designed for one purpose is used for another, especially when something like OAuth is much more complicated, used for single sign-on. When we mix models and change from a user in a browser doing manual steps to CLIs and APIs that are automated. If you have one credential system or identity system covering both, it's a danger. When we move from browser to API authentication, we again are switching contexts. So I will not dwell on this, but I did not want to leave with just sort of crying wolf, so to speak. There are, for those of us who care about defending against this, there are mitigation steps. No perfect solutions, but we can certainly think about better prevention, detection, and remediation in the application area, the SSO area, and the connecting relationship or pathway, right? So if we look at supply chain attacks like the Golden SAML, there's nothing new here, but to be more diligent and careful. And we have to be more knowledgeable about what our SSO system is using underneath. There's no choice. If they're using OAuth, we need to know that versus SAML. And we might be able to put in place tighter controls when we understand that OAuth brings risk. OAuth device code has higher risk of phishing attacks. We may still be able to tighten up controls if we know that, such as session timeouts. That's very common with websites. For whatever reason, not so common in implementations of OAuth, and therefore some implementations of SSO. Just these tokens should expire after a certain time, and then you have to re-authenticate as a user. You can, of course, put in policies to look at IP addresses and devices. These are well-known techniques, but should be revisited in light of SSO systems. Detecting is a hard problem. We have to go beyond the logs. We actually probably need to be thinking about behavioral detection. Assuming compromise, how can we still distinguish this user doing valid activities from the attacker who has compromised their credential? And think about that. Behavioral detection, ML approaches are difficult, but they're improving in this area. We just need to focus on it more. I'm not suggesting we have to create our own ML models, but we can certainly look at vendors. So Microsoft Cloud Defender does have some ML targeted at OAuth, which may help with some of the SSO compromise scenarios. Remediation, I just want to point out that because take AWS's implementation, there were so many versions of credentials from SAML maybe to OAuth to API keys. If you have to do remediation in an incident, your operating procedures have to be clear to revoke all tokens, temporary or otherwise, and maybe cut across administrative domains because some other group may be in charge of identity than the investigation or forensics or incident response team. So that is very basic stuff. When we talk about protocol abuses, such as the Okta custom identity protocol hook or the AWS SSO. Just be aware, anytime you get confusion and complexity and mixed models, you need to look at it further. Anytime someone's customized, like Okta did with sort of SAML hooks, or someone's doing custom OAuth, you have to be careful and probably tighten up controls. We don't have to know inside knowledge. Often this is very obvious from the documentation of the vendor. When you look at AWS's documentation, they throw around terms like OIDC, even though they do not do a pure OIDC implementation, but you understand that OAuth is involved. And you can minimize the OAuth risk. You cannot remove it completely, but you can certainly do things like look at blocking device code flow. We have no smart TVs in our enterprise. There's no reason for this to be in our enterprise. Session timeouts, IP lists, better detection, clear remediation. We can do a lot of the same things. Unfortunately, with AWS or any implementation, you might have to be very specific to the implementation. So I'm not here to cover all of this. Again, you can look at the good work done by Tafani DeReaper. Here are the references. There's some very good recommendations that are very AWS specific about how to do better prevention and detection. The detection is about along the lines of behavioral. Hey, are the locations of certain actions suspicious? Right? And you can look at the logging and see which IP addresses. You can understand this and implement policies to maybe alert on suspicious activity. Prevention is tough. AWS considers a lot of the API calls cannot be locked down because they're part of authentication. So, but understanding this is the first step. And finally, with obfuscated attacks, this is very difficult. We are not in control of this, the vendor is, but certain things like timeouts and forced reauthentication, sometimes you do have controls. Be very aware of password resets, these edge cases, those are often where the risk is introduced, where credentials are resurfaced. And pivots, the Microsoft device code flow. Again, no secret solutions. Have to look at it hard to lock down prevention, better mitigation once compromise happens, and better detection. So thank you so much for those of you still remaining here as I've gone way over time. If there are any questions, I would be happy to answer them. But given the time constraints, please reach out to me if you have follow-on questions, and I would be happy to converse with you in any way on this subject.